Good morning, Room 219. So today we're going to work on our read aloud for the social studies book, Guns for General Washington. So please go ahead and get your copy of your book and turn to chapters 15 and 16 so we can go ahead and get started. Hit pause if you need to find your book, but if you already have it, then just go ahead and turn to page 92. Okay? I'm sorry, 92 is 16. What am I saying? Chapter 15 is on page 88, página 88. Okay? So General Washington stepped back from the flagpole and saluted. Behind him, the regiments were drawn up. A squad fired a volley in the air, and the men presented arms. Then the fife and drum company marched smartly across the parade ground. At the end of the field, they turned and broke into the rousing version of the Liberty Song. The red, white, and blue ensign, just raised by the commander, was the very first flag of the colonial cause. It was called the Grand Union Flag, and it snapped bravely in the Cambridge breeze, telling the world that the American colonies were now a nation and no longer subjects to the Britain's king. Now, do you know how the colonial flag used to look? How the first American flag originally looked? Okay, well, I advise you to look it up because I would love to draw it on the board, but you need the colors, and all I have is a black marker. So look it up. It's actually a pretty interesting design, and look into what are the symbols of the flag. They all, even the colors signify something. Okay. The day the ceremony took place was the very day that Henry and his men, far to the north, were dragging their sunken cannon out of the Mohawk River. Remember what happened to the last cannon when they were crossing the river? Right, it sank. But it wasn't too far, so they dragged it out of the mud because they weren't going to leave anything behind. Back at his desk after the flag raising, Washington thought about Henry's artillery train. He reread a report just in from the hardworking colonel. The guns were on their way, but they were moving very slowly because of bad weather and worse terrain. Henry wrote it would take longer to deliver them than he thought. Washington ran a tired hand over his eyes. It had been a bad winter for the Continental Army, just as it had been for Howe and the Redcoats. For one thing, Washington had to deal with thousands of New England troops that were quitting camp. They had enlisted at the beginning of July for 6 months. Now their tour of duty was over. The worried officers tried hard to get their men to re-enlist, but only a fraction did, for there were no re-enlistment bounty. The military chest is totally exhausted, Washington wrote to Philadelphia. The paymaster has not a single dollar in hand. So do you know what the military chest was? Do you think it was an actual chest? Well, it wasn't. A military chest is pretty much the bank for the army. Chest meaning, what would you keep in a chest? You think of treasure, money. So when they say military chest, they're talking about the funds to pay for the supplies they need for the war, including soldiers. But the lack of bonus money wasn't as bad as the lack of morale. The colonial troops were tough and independent. They had joined the army with high hopes. Now they were cold, homesick, disillusioned, and angry at the long stalemate. For some, patriotism had become an empty word. Nothing was happening. British or no British, they were going home to their shops, farms, and families. Trying to keep his army from melting away, Washington suggested attacking the Redcoats in Boston, but he was overruled by Congress and the War Council. Without enough powder and artillery, a head-on attack was too risky. So the general had to settle for strengthening his lines and capturing an outpost called Cobble Hill. The weeks dragged on. But by the beginning of 1776, the worst seemed over. New men and officers came pouring in to replace the ones who'd left for home, and the army grew to over 10,500 men. This was very satisfying, but numbers meant little without the power of weapons. Washington, like his British enemy, were still playing a waiting game. General Howe waited for a military convoy crossing the stormy Atlantic. General Washington waited for the artillery convoy crawling from Fort Ticonderoga. The question that worried George Washington on that January day was which of the two convoys would arrive first. So, what do you think? Do you think the American supplies will come first or the British? I don't know. I don't know either. So why don't we go ahead and read? We'll find out. We're close to the end of the book. We'll finish this after spring break. They had been on the trail all day, but Henry, trying to make up lost time, decided to push on a while longer. At that point, the Becker's wagon was up in front, and J.P. was feeling pleased with himself. He was, with only a little help from his pa, he'd managed the horses like an expert. The heavy vehicles creaked slowly along the narrow trail on the west bank of the Hudson. It was growing dark, and the white mist was creeping over the river. J.P.'s father dozed on the seat beside him. Over his shoulder, the boy could see the other sleds and carts following behind. The drivers and soldiers were surprisingly quiet. Even the animals seemed to doze in their traces as they trudged away. A pale half-moon rose, winking through the pines, while the mist crept in and out of the dark branches. Caw, caw, caw! A flight of crows exploded from the trees, complaining loudly at the human intruders. Somewhere an owl hooted, getting ready to hunt for his supper. J.P. was feeling tired. He was only vaguely uneasy. Looking around, he noticed some landmarks and recognized where he was. 20 years ago, this part of the countryside had been a bloody battleground. It was during the French and Indian Wars, a time when French troops and their Indian allies fought the British for control of New England and Canada. The British had finally won, but only after years of heavy fighting. On this very spot, there had been a fierce battle. J.P. had heard the whole story from the old-timers. The fight had raged all day long, seesawing back and forth, and there were many killed on both sides. Some of the bodies had been flung into a nearby pond. It was known ever since as Bloody Pond. Okay, that is a creepy thing to be passing at night. The folks said the forest was haunted by the ghost of those who wouldn't stay down in their watery grave. Inching along the pines looming overhead, J.P. remembered the grisly tale. His eyes were heavy with sleep, and in the gloom he thought he could almost see the flitting shades of Bloody Pond. He stifled a cry. Yes, there they were. French soldiers in blue and British in red. Their uniforms torn and bloodied. Fierce Iroquois wielding war axes. Painted Mohawks with dripping scalps dangling from their belts. The phantoms were all around him, fighting one another, gliding in and out of the dark, dank mists. So what does JP think he's seeing right now? Yeah, he's seeing the ghosts of all these dead people from the war, of the French and Indian War. And is it a pleasant vision? I'm sorry, that's creepy. JP held his breath and listened. Now he heard, ever so faintly, the sound of Indian war whoops, the snap of muskets, and the screams of the dying. or were they just the usual noises of the night forest? The boy shivered. He shook his head to clear away the frightening, ghostly images. Suddenly, his two lead horses reared and whinnied in fear. There was a scuffle of hooves as a second pair reacted to them nervously. J.P. tugged hard at the reins. His father woke with a start and dove forward to help. Behind them, the next driver pulled his team with an oath, barely avoiding a pile-up. Meanwhile, the spooked horses kept bucking and snorting, refusing to move ahead. "Hold steady, John!" his father cried. "Hold steady!" "It's the aunts, Pa!" J.P. gasped. "Bloody pond! The horses can see 'em!" Questions were being shouted up and down the line. Some troopers raced over with a lighted torch, and Colonel Knox rode up anxiously. The troopers ran to the front of the Becker's wagon and bent down. In a moment they stood up, holding a young colonial soldier between them. The man's hair was matted, his uniform was muddy, and he wore a foolish grin. He also reeked of brandy. When dragged to the side of the trail and doused with water, he came slowly out of his drunken stupor. So what did spook the horses? Was it the ghosts? Nope, it seems to be this American soldier who got drunk. Let's see what's his story. Questioning him, the colonel learned that the man came from a nearby Fort Lyman. Making his way back to camp, he lost his way and decided to have a quiet nap in the middle of the trail. So why was this man on the trail? Just to take a nap. That was it. "Blasted fool," Will Knox shouted. He grabbed the soldier's coat, gave him a tongue lashing, and started him back to the fort with a well-placed kick. So he just gave him a good yelling. Grinning, the colonel took off his hat and wiped his brow. "I guess we'd had enough ruckus for one day," he said. "Pass the word. We'll make camp here." After supper, J.P. rolled himself gratefully in his blankets. Luckily, nobody but his father had heard his frightened panicky outbursts. No harm was done, and he was glad that his ghost had turned out to be merely a drunken soldier. Still, John Becker would be very happy in the morning to turn his back on Bloody Pond. And that's the end of this chapter. So I'm going to send you 2 questions. Remember, 1 for each chapter. And I want you to answer them on the Google Doc. And remember, this is it for this novel for now. We will return to it after spring break. All right? I hope this video helps you. And I will see you later today. Okay. Bye-bye.